Hello everybody, welcome to section 5.1, and we're going to start some basic trigonometry. And we've seen trigonometry before when we're back at the beginning of the year. We would introduce some basics here for you in terms of some right triangle trigonometry. We're going to take that a few extra steps further here though in this chapter and start adding in some information that maybe you may or may not be familiar with. Very important for us to pay attention to all of the definitions when it comes to section 5.1. And one of the most basic definitions that is out there is the definition of what do we mean by an angle. Right? What is an angle? Right? So take a minute right now, and I'll pause, for you to check out the definition on page 428 of your book. Go ahead, look it up. Okay, so I always start by asking the question, what is an angle? Right? And most of the answers that I get are something along the lines of, well, it measures a distance, right? Well, no. Right? An angle is a measure of a quantity similar to distance, right? In distance, we take a ruler, we can just take a straight line and measure along that line. But we use a protractor to measure an angle, right? So what does that mean for us? Well, an angle an angle is one of those basic measures in nature that we use, and it's a measure of the amount of rotation. So it's a measure of the amount of rotation. That's supposed to say rotation, trust me, it does. Of rotation from an initial side to a terminal side about a single point that we call the vertex. Right? So the angle is the amount of rotation that we have between these two. And it needs to be clearly understood what that means for us, because all of the rest of everything else that we do in trigonometry rests on these definitions. So what is a vertex? A vertex for an angle is the point in the plane about which the angle rotates. The initial side is where we start measuring the rotation, and the terminal side is where we stop measuring that amount of rotation. So the angle is that measure of rotation between the initial side and terminal side. Rotation amount. Right? So when you think angle, think rotation amount. So we do have some measures that we already know when it comes to measuring rotation. Those measures are some of these kind of angles. We call an acute angle from geometry an angle that has a measure of less than 90 degrees of rotation. So we could say less than 90 degrees of rotation. If you recall some of these definitions from geometry, a few others went like this. The right angle was exactly 90 degrees of rotation. An obtuse angle is going to be an angle that has a measure between 90 and 180 degrees. So for our purposes, we'll say greater than 90 degrees, but not equal to 180 degrees. And a straight angle, right? So here's our obtuse angle. Here's our right angle. Here's our acute angle, which leaves one more choice right here, and this is our straight angle. A straight angle is an angle that makes exactly 180 degrees of rotation. So if you imagine us taking a straight line and dividing it up in such a way that we treat it as an angle with our vertex here at one side and we measure around, we call that 180 degrees a straight angle. Okay. All right, so we would need to know that because whenever we measure angles, of course, in basic geometry, when we start measuring angles, it doesn't matter where we put the angles, right? Any orientation is okay 30 degrees is 30 degrees is 30 degrees, right? Or let's say I take this particular angle right here and measure it with my protractor. Let's see if I can get this about right here. This angle that I made right here, let's see if I can get this about straighten out. There we go. About, ooh, looks like 52 degrees, right? This is approximately 52 degrees of rotation. So if I were actually measuring 52 degrees or so of rotation, right, that's what it would look like, right? And it doesn't matter which way I did it. I just said, okay, my orientation is such that I'm rotating clockwise right here. So here's my vertex. Here's the initial side. And here's the terminal side. That's it, right? All that angle measures is just the amount of rotation. So we need a little bit of more terminology right here. Let's just keep going with this. It would be one thing if we were just to stick with the basic geometry definitions, but trigonometry does something special. It takes those angles and puts them into the XY axis system to give us a reference, give us some reference as to what's going on. So when we talk about a reference point, what we mean is that standard position. An angle in standard position, let me give you this definition. An angle in standard position is an angle that has its vertex at the origin. So it's very specific. It's an angle that has a vertex at the origin and has initial side along the positive x-axis. So our initial side is always along that positive x-axis. Right? And actually, this is a very good definition to have written out. So an angle in standard position is an angle with a vertex at the origin, and has its initial side along the positive x-axis. Okay, as long as those two conditions are met, that angle is in standard position. Now it matters because we now have a reference system and a way to actually determine where that angle is. So if we have an angle that rotates in the counterclockwise direction like this, we call that a positive angle. So positive angles are associated with rotation in the counterclockwise direction of rotation. Now on the other hand, we could look at a negative angle, and a negative angle is an angle that is measured in the clockwise direction. Let me move this over here a little bit. So for our negative angle, we always associate that with clockwise direction. Right? So it's very important to us because when we're talking about angles, it will matter in the way that we arrange our angles as we go in rotation, either in the clockwise or counterclockwise direction. So if we're going in the clockwise direction, we can say that our angle, starting at 0 degrees of rotation in the counterclockwise direction, first takes us to a right angle at 90 degrees if we are along the positive y-axis in standard position. If we continue, 180 degrees is measured along the negative side of the x-axis. Continuing a little bit further, 270 degrees is measured along the negative y-axis over here. And then finally, one full rotation would be 360 degrees. Most people are familiar with these measures from 0 to 360 degrees. We can continue rotation beyond 360 degrees. So for example, if we were to create an angle, and I'll just make a smaller one over here somewhere, if we were to create an angle that went around in positive direction, we could go 360 degrees of rotation. We could make it 2 full rotations for 720 degrees. right? So we could have 720 degrees of rotation. So we are allowed to have angles in the positive direction as well as the negative direction. If we measured an angle of negative 270 degrees, negative 270 degrees is the equivalent of saying it's coterminal with the angle positive 90 degrees. They both terminate in the same position. So we call those coterminal. And we'll talk about those coterminal angles in a moment. Okay, so more to come.